feel led to speak on sharing in the cup. It's a blessing. Now, it's not a blessing in the flesh because the flesh doesn't like suffering, even though the flesh always brings upon you suffering. It's not a bless mentally because of the stress levels. It's not physically natural because of the fall, the nature we took on after the fall, to actually want to be self-sacrificing. Is painful. We would rather, in fact, you see it from a very tiny infant that hasn't learned anything yet. They're selfish. Now we see glimmers of times when they're not, and you see the Spirit of the Lord, even if they don't know the Lord, where they're sharing everything, and it's so precious. But usually, especially if you have two boys, Mom knows this very well, they're going to fight over whatever the other one has, and it don't matter. You can get identical things. I want that one. I was motivated to look up one of the sons of Zebedee. If you remember in Matthew 4, when it talks about him first finding the first few disciples, not all of them, but I mean all of them had the same response, but he found Philip and Andrew first. And he said, "Follow me." They dropped everything they were doing. They were about their business. They were fishing, providing for their family. And they immediately dropped it and left. And then he came a little further and found another pair of brothers, James and John, who were working for their father. They were with their physical father. Now, it's one thing in your mind to say, okay, well, I'll drop everything I'm doing and go when you're working for yourself or someone else. But when you're working for your physical father, and you're supposed to honor and respect him, just to drop and say, I'm gone, is a tall order, especially back then. But they didn't question it. Just like we as his children, we don't question when he says, deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow us. Follow me. In Matthew, where James and John's mother came to Jesus and asked, "Can one of my sons be set on your right and one on your left?" You remember his question is, "Are you willing to partake of the cup I'm going to partake of?" And they all said, "Yes, yes, indeed." He said, "Indeed you will." He said, "But to sit on my right and left is not mine to give." In fact, if we are going to share in the reward, we must joyously partake of the cup. So many times throughout, and for the sake of time, because I want to read the account of James whenever he was martyred out of Jesus freaks. But so many times, repetitiously, he said, "Deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me." If you love anything on this earth, anyone on this earth more than you love me, you're not worthy of me. You're not worthy of my reward. You got to understand that the Father laid down everything. His only beloved Son, who was with him from the beginning, they were equals. And Jesus, likewise, he gave up the equality. He didn't, and the Scripture says he didn't hold it as something selfishly to be hung on to. He sacrificed it to become subservient to the Father, to come down here as mankind, born in poverty. One that you see so many people, they want to be prestigious and God's favorite son and get all these preferential treatments and all. But when Jesus instructs his disciples, which includes us, he always said, if the world marvels over you, you're in a dangerous place. Because if you're doing what I did, they're going to hate you just like they hate me. In Isaiah, we see he was not one of beauty, of charisma, that everyone would flock to him and everybody would admire him. Most people didn't give him a thought. In fact, I can only imagine the picking that happened when he was a young kid. Even whenever he was facing the Sadducees and Pharisees as a grown man, they said, we even know who our Father is. So it was still there, that stigma, because of God not having a male human involved in producing him. They considered him a bastard. And that was their little innuendo. Well, we know who our Father is. You don't even have a clue. But he knew who his Father is. He knew his Father was the one upstairs, the God, the one they claimed to serve. by their actions. In Jesus Freaks, in 44 AD, James, John, come with me. James and his brother John followed their mother, who knelt at Jesus' feet. Lord, you will do a favor for me, she asked. What would you like me to do? Jesus asked. Their mother said, grant that one of my two sons may sit at your right and the other at your left in your kingdom. And he says, you don't know what you're asking for. Then he turned to the two men. Can you drink the cup I am going to drink? Obviously, we see that their faithful life, they did drink of the cup. But at that time, before the Holy Spirit actually indwelt them, I don't know that they fully understood what they were saying then. Because how many times have we questioned what we've been going through? How many times, as mature as we may be in the Lord at any given time, it's hard to count it all joy when you're sharing in that cup. And sometimes you don't even, you've let your mind go so far off the tracks in a way that you don't realize you're sharing in the cup at that time. You think you're just going through misery or a trial or tribulation. When someone speaks ill or accuses you of a lie or whatever it may be. Their answer was, we can. James and John answered together, didn't hesitate. Both of them said the same thing. Jesus said to them, you will indeed drink from my cup. Several years later, King Herod Agrippa decided to stop the spread of Christianity by striking its leaders. He had James arrested and sentenced to death on the basis of one man's testimony. However, when the accusers saw James's extraordinary courage and steadfast joy, even when he condemned to die, the man was deeply touched in his heart. There on the spot, the accuser made a decision for Christ. He boldly cried out, I want to follow Jesus also. I am a Christian. The soldiers led James to be executed. Along the way, his accuser stopped the apostle and fell down at his feet. I am so sorry for what I have done, he cried. The blood of an innocent man is on my hands. Please, please, before you die, please forgive me. James paused for a moment, then said, peace be to you, brother, and gave him a holy kiss. Then the man said, you should not receive the crown of martyrdom alone. I will die with you. He was immediately sentenced to death, and they were both brought to the place of execution. Minutes later, the two were beheaded together. That's the witness of someone that has truly embraced the cup, that doesn't look at their outside circumstances enough to askew their vision, that they've already set from the time that they said, yes, I'll follow you. Who else are we going to follow? You have the words of life. And there are countless trials that they faced with him. That at that moment, James, he wasn't bitter, he wasn't angry, he wasn't full of any kind of physical self-preservation. And it didn't specify here exactly what kind of mannerisms and what kind of actions James did, but it was enough to immediately move the one that accused him falsely. And he knew what he had done then. He immediately turned, and not only did he turn his life over to Christ right then, he basically demanded that he would share with James at that time the same kind of punishment. Now, the world out here, as far as churchianity goes, and this is not everyone, because I'm sure there's people in the congregations that just haven't been made aware. But most of the ones that constantly set about to preach, even no matter what kind of truth you bring to them, want your best life now. In fact, I've heard very renowned ministers being asked by just public newscasters or interviewers why you don't preach on sin. Well, you say, I don't want my people to be depressed. Well, you know, if you use that philosophy when a plane's going down to all your people, oh, you don't need your seatbelts, you don't really need the oxygen, you don't need the parachute, it's all fine, it's just a little turbulence. But you're going to be highly blessed. You're going to have a great ride. You're going to have all kinds of peanuts and whatever else amenities we have. We'll even give you a rebate for your poor service or whatever. That plane's probably going to go down with a whole lot of unprepared people because they're being fed a bill of goods that is not there. They're being fed lies. But if you have one that says, hey, guess what? The plane's going down. You need to make ready. You need to prepare. You need to get your parachutes on. You need to get in your seats, get your oxygen mask on. You're not going to have the blood of the innocent on your hands if you're that person, because you're telling them the truth. Matthew 10, in closing, we're starting in verse 24. You know, James and John, and in fact, the epistles, the apostles, all of them at some point accounts how honor and privilege it is to share in that cup. And we see it that every one of them was martyred. They all gave up their lives. That's how that the life of the one man that changed the entire world, even the calendar issue, the way people date time is based off on Christ's life. Everything. He's the one man that changed the entire world from history. And they're still trying to deal with that, trying to deal with the afterfall, the ones that don't want us to follow, the ones that are being controlled by the enemy. And most of them have chosen to believe a delusion. They don't even realize they're being controlled by the enemy. But this is what it means to be his disciple. And it's not just the 12. We are his disciples. We are learning from the Master, or we're supposed to be following the Master. A disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master. It is enough for the disciple that he become as his teacher and the slave as his master. If they have called the head of the house Beelzebul, how much more will the members of his household? Therefore do not fear them, for there is nothing covered that will not be revealed, and hidden that will not be known. What I tell you in the darkness, speak in the light, and what you hear whispered in your ear, proclaim upon the housetops. That's a boldness. That's a boldness. We see Stephen, we see Peter, we see Paul, we see all of those guys that we may have a little background on before we see it. I mean, look at Peter. He just got through denying the Lord, even with cursing. But he prepared himself. He didn't lose faith to the point he could boldly stand in front of the religious leaders and deliver those sermons that he delivered that was just lay it bare, show the truth. So many people don't want the mirror hidden, held up, cleaned in front of their vision. It's too painful to deal with. You don't want to admit what you are capable of without the Lord. Verse 27, what I tell you in the darkness, speak in the light, and what you hear whispered in your ear, proclaim upon the housetops. And do not fear those who kill the body, but are unable to kill the soul. Jesus himself, Pilate says, you know, I got the power to take your life or give it back to you. And he said, no, you don't. You only have the power that my Father in heaven gives you. He wasn't trying to be churlish. He wasn't trying to be starting an argument, starting a fight, or pushing buttons. He was just telling the simple truth. He's putting it out, and it was for our benefit as well, because we can take confidence. Our hands, we are in the Lord's hands, and the only person that can remove us from the Lord's hands is ourselves. He's the prodigal father sitting there on the porch, waiting, looking at the horizon, waiting for the prodigal son to return. And the moment he does, he doesn't treat him like a pardoned criminal or some kind of slave. He treats him as his son. He casts the memory of what we did into the sea of forgetfulness. He doesn't even want to be reminded of it again. Verse 29, are not two sparrows sold for a cent, and yet one of them will fall, and not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. I'm remembering Charles Templeton, who did all those great works. He's way more effective than Billy Graham whenever he was working his ministry. But yet he allowed his few to get askew, and he saw the cover of that magazine with that starving infant and said, well, God must either not care or he must be hateful to allow this kind of suffering. Suffering is inevitable. We brought it upon ourselves. When Adam and Eve chose to sin, and we can say, well, why is Adam and Eve called the shots for all of us? Well, look at our own lives. Have we not chose to rebel? Just on what we knew at the time was right or wrong. We knew when we were doing something that it wasn't right, whether we were told or not. Verse 30, but the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Therefore, do not fear. You are of more value than many sparrows. In fact, we're so valuable. He poured out every drop of sweat and every drop of blood that his son would bear in his body. Let his body be ravaged, shredded, unrecognizable to purchase us, to remove us from our judgment. And it wasn't just a matter of removing us from our judgment and pardoning us. When he looks at us, when the accuser brings one of us before him, he looks at us, he sees Christ. There is no record of sin. It's all a bunch of bogus mess. That's why he can say, like he did Joshua the high priest, now you hush, this is my firebrand. Take off the dirty robes, wash him, clean him, put righteous robes on him. That's Jesus' righteousness. We're hid inside Jesus. He bore our shame, he bore our infirmities, and he bore our sin. He gave us his righteousness and his peace and his joy. Now, it's our choice whether we operate in that. It's our choice when our body says, oh, this bites, man, this really is horrible. Or just, my uncle, when I was a young man, he turned around and had a business. He had a mercantile business. This is the effects that stress alone, not just physical illness or ailments or injuries, but stress alone. He started losing, he always had a lush head of hair, always in good health, it seemed on the surface. He started going bald. I did not know this. I came up from a visit from Mississippi, and he was crew cut. I mean, almost as slick as David. And I thought, well, that's not his normal style, because he always cared about his appearance. He always wanted his hair just right. And I said, so you decided to go crew cut? And at the time, I was crew cut. I said, cool choice. He said, well, it wasn't by choice. I had to. He was losing handfuls of hair. His body was just shutting down. And it was and he regained his health the moment he sold his business. That just the stress of that endeavor in a physical standpoint was, so how much more when our soul's on the line? When the devil's speaking these lies into our ears. Our peace and our joy is from the Lord. Embrace it. Embrace the cross. Verse 31, therefore do not fear, you are of more value than many sparrows. Every one, therefore, who shall confess me before men, I will also confess him before the Father who is in heaven. But whoever shall deny me before men, I will also deny him before the Father who is in heaven. That doesn't mean just a verbal, I deny or renounce the Lord. There's some people, we have it recorded in different martyrs where they did renounce, or they were posed the question and they didn't. But you can deny him in your actions. You can deny him in your lifestyle. You can deny him in the things that nobody sees you do, but he does. When you know and you continue to not seek help from the flesh, to put the flesh down in your private life, and you continue to think, act, and behave in a way and live in a way that is not right. And you can look on the surface like a shining new vessel. Doesn't always mean we are allowing ourselves to be cleansed all the way through. Do not think that I've come to bring peace on this earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I came to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and a man's enemies will be the members of his household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. And he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. That's saying if we don't share in the cup, if we don't willingly and joyously share in the cup, we're not worthy of him. And in truth, we're not. He who has found his life shall lose it. In other words, if we go seeking to make our best life now, we're going to lose our life. When he comes back and judges us according to the books, which is Jesus' life and what he taught, we're not going to match up. There's not going to be, oh, well, okay, because he's not going to have sin in heaven again. When we're made one with Jesus, when Jesus took our sin and he gave it up and he was risen pure as he was before he took on our sin. He's not going to be one with sin. Sin cannot dwell in the presence of the Father. So if we are holding on to something that we won't let loose, that's going to keep us from the kingdom. And it's our own choosing. We don't have to hold on to it. He who has lost his life for my sake shall find it. And that doesn't necessarily mean, it will for some, mean actual your physical life. Like someone's going to say, renounce Christ or I'll kill you. But losing our life means I'll give up job opportunities. I'll give up a career in sports if I was good enough to be in the sports or something like that, just to follow his commands, just to follow his instructions. And don't care what other people, oh, well, he's a fanatic, he's a holy roller, he's better. No, it's not a matter about being better than anybody. It's about trying to live like Christ lived. It didn't matter whether you was out not bringing attention to yourself like John the Baptist or whether you was like Jesus. They found fault with both of them. From one end to the other. So if they're not being called at that time, they're going to have a problem with you. They're going to be offended by the things you stand for. We're not to make them offended. He who receives you receives me, and he who receives me receives him who sent me. If they don't receive us as his representatives, hopefully we are properly being his representatives. They aren't receiving him. It reminds me of Philip. When Philip asked, show us the Father, or was it Thomas? One of them asked, show us the Father. I think it was Philip. And he said, have I been so long with you and yet you don't even realize? When you see me, I'm the exact representation of my Father. So many people want to produce the Father as some kind of overbearing, judgmental, walk this line or I'll smash you. That's not the Father. Now, he won't play with his words. He won't play with his commands. There will be a day of reckoning. But he's very merciful. You can read all the prophets, all the minor prophets. He would put out a punishment on the children of Israel, and immediately, as soon as he finished saying, this is what all you'll get, he'd give off a list of what you get blessings if you immediately repent. He'd stay it. That's the Father's love. Verse 41, he who receives a prophet in the name of a prophet shall receive a prophet's reward. He who receives a righteous man in the name of a righteous man shall receive a righteous man's reward. And whoever in the name of a disciple gives to one of these little ones even a cup of cold water to drink, truly I say, he shall not lose his reward. There is so many rewards that are laid up for us if we remain faithful. And we shouldn't be seeking just for the reward, because he did not. But it should be a joy. He embraced the cross because the joy set before him, which was you, me, and everyone else that will ever come to him. And I praise him for his love and his tenderness and the blessing and the honor, even though it's very difficult, to share in the cup of his suffering. Because if you share in the cup, you will share in the reward. Praise God.